Good evening and welcome to the Legion Cantina. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the newly buffed Rebel Troopers for the Rebel faction in Star Wars Legion. So, while this isn't a new buff, it is a buff that came in a little while ago now with Legion 2.6. Essentially, the cards stayed almost exactly the same. The only difference was they had Agile 1 added to them. Now, while this is quite a simple change, it is very impactful to the way you can play the Rebel Troopers and sort of how survivable they are in game. So we'll do what we normally do, strengths, weaknesses, how you can use them in game, some lists and things like that. So first of all, talking about the strengths of the Rebel Trooper, the addition of the Agile 1 keyword is a huge deal. It essentially means that previously with Rebel Troopers, in order to get that dodge to set up for the Nimble, you would have to spend an entire action on it. And in the new version of Legion, that really wouldn't be possible most of the time. So now, if you perform a move action, you get that free dodge in there as well, which essentially in the new game, you're virtually always moving during a turn. So now if you're doing like a move shoot or a move standby or whatever, you do get that free dodge to start that nimble chain, which is really nice. As I've kind of hinted at there, nimble's a really solid keyword. Getting that dodge back after you spend a dodge is a big deal, and there is a lot of dodge synergy in Rebels as well, so it is fairly solid. The sort of black dice, the shooting, isn't too bad. You don't get surges, but you get a single black dice for melee and at range 3 for the basic troopers, and then you get white surging saves. We'll talk about white surging saves in a second. There are ways to buff the shooting as well. So talking about these heavy weapon options, so you can get weapons at sort of range 3 and range 4 that give you the critical 1 keyword, which is really valuable here because you're normally pulling out a surge or two when you're making those shooting attacks. So those heavy weapon options can be really nice for buffing the Rebel Troopers up. Moving over to the weaknesses. White saves are a problem now, especially with some of the dice pools that now exist and the sort of the way cover can be quite swingy up and down. They're not entirely useless. I've been a bit harsh here, but they are problematic. And it also means that if you don't get that defensive tech set up, i.e. that dodge at the start of the turn, it makes it a whole lot more challenging to keep these units on the board. And it does mean that if you are sort of in a range 3 shooting war, which doesn't happen as much now, you are going to struggle to compete with units that have red saves, that have sort of more firepower perhaps than these Rebel Troopers are capable of offering. The other difficulty is that once you have generated those dodges, you have no way to hold on to them at the end of the turn. So it's all very well on turn 1, and I'd actually say that turn 1 is arguably one of the better turns for Rebel Troopers as a unit, because performing that move onto the board and then normally performing a second move, although you might be doing something else, but normally that second move does mean that actually a lot of the time you're going to have 2 dodges and you're probably going to be in heavy cover, which means you are fairly resistant to chip damage apart from when those crits come through. And there are sort of some builds of Rebel Troopers that will mitigate those crits by putting situational awareness on as well. But yeah, those turns are really nice. The problem comes after that turn 1 going into that turn 2, turn 3. Because Rebel Troopers are very rarely going to be the first unit coming out of your stack unless you're sort of holding back your more powerful units for later in the turn, which maybe is actually more possible on turn 2 and turn 3. So maybe those troopers have a bit more power than I'm giving them credit for. But essentially, the problem comes with that in order to get a dodge, you have to activate. And that means you have to activate before your opponent in order to get the value from this keyword. What this also means is that you have to have obviously at least 3 core. Normally you're probably going to have 4, but it depends on, again, what kind of build you're going for. If you do have that 3 core, it means that even if you do go first of all on those core units, there will then be 2 core units guaranteed that don't have dodges on them from that agile keyword, so they'll just be shot instead. So it does lead to sort of issues in terms of like the dodges are only good if you can get them before you are shot. They're not sort of a proactive thing. You have to be sort of reactive, and if you're not getting out ahead of the sort of opponent's units, it means you're not going to get those dodges on you. Courage 1 continues to be a problem. Rebel commanders are Courage 2 generally, so that's okay. The Courage bubble can help, but it basically means a lot of the time, if you're not dead, you're going to be suppressed, but a lot of the time these troopers will just be shot to pieces before they can get anything going. But yeah, they're a solid unit post buffs. They don't do anything particularly special. Yeah, they are a reasonable addition to any rebel army. In terms of the heavy weapon options that I hinted at earlier, there's 4 options. There's the Z6, which is 6 white at range 3 with no surges. There's the SX21, which is 2 red, 2 white at range 2, which gives you impact 1. I don't understand why that keyword's on it. The DLT, which range 4, black, black, white with critical 1. And the ion gun, which is at range 3, critical 1, impact 1, ion 1, black, black, white. The top 2 guns are interesting, but bad would be my sort of take on them. The Z6, you're basically raising the variance in favor of losing consistency. So the Z6 obviously has the highest ceiling of any of these guns, and actually at range 3, which is where you want to be shooting anyway, it is interesting. But without surges, it means that the Z6 is only actually adding, I think, about a hit and a half. I haven't got them down, but yeah, I think it's about a hit, or it might be 2 hits actually. I think it might be 2 hits. No, it's a hit and a half. Hit and a half. So that means your rebel troopers, if you put the Z6 on them, are on average only throwing about 2.5 hits or 3 without an aim, which is not very good. The SX21 is actually better in terms of firepower thanks to those red dice. Does give you a few more facings, but has the requirement you get to range 2. And this is not a strong range 2 option in the world of range 2 options, and it's not really where the rebel troopers excel. Like skirting around that kind of range 3, using those dodges, getting the heavy cover, stuff like that is kind of where the rebel troopers want to be. You've got fleets for that more up close work, so that's kind of, I think the SX21 is an interesting gun, but I don't think it adds a huge amount of value here. And the Impact 1 is essentially a useless keyword, unfortunately, for the Rebel Troopers, because you might get 1 natural crit from this dice pool, so then you're putting 2 hits through on armor at range 2. Like, that doesn't make any sense, unfortunately. So yeah, interesting but not good would be my summary of the top 2 ones. The bottom 2 options, however, are much more the kind of thing that you would actually look to run in your army. And again, they're not strictly better or worse than each other. They just do different things. The DLT-20 is worse in every way apart from the Ion Trooper, except for the fact it can shoot at range 4. And that's a bigger deal than it used to be now because of the way cover works. Essentially what it means is there is now, with the way cover works, more of an incentive to split fire. And if you want to split fire at different range bands, that's where the DLT-20 comes in really useful. It does unfortunately mean you wouldn't get the critical 1 keyword on your 4 black dice and the rest of the unit. What it would mean, though, is that if you've got 3 troopers maybe shooting at something, maybe even just to put some, 4 troopers trying to shoot at something just to put some suppression down, then you can send the DLT-20 at something a bit further away. And actually with that critical 1, you're probably putting 2 hits through on average, which is not bad at all. So I think the DLT-20 is interesting. My preference, though, is for the MPL 57 ion gun, because it has 2 extra keywords, which, given what I think is about to, well, or probably currently is one of the best lists in experimental droids, having that impact 1 and that ion 1 is just so useful. It basically doubles your damage output or adds extra hits against armor, because generally with a rebel trooper dice pool you might get 1 natural crit, one crit from critical 1, and then you can add an additional 1 for impact 1 with ion. So it might just give you that extra hit that may actually allow you to then convert with that ion on top of that as well. The ion thing is situational, but it has 2 main uses. Ion can strip shields off droidicas, so as long as you hit them, it will automatically take 1 shield away before you roll defense die or anything. The other thing it does is it can mean that if you can shoot B2s before they move, it can remove a super B2 squad action, which, to be honest, is probably worth an entire rebel squad just to try and have a go at that. So I think 2 or 3 ion guns or DLT-20s could be really useful for sort of buffing that rebel trooper firepower. But the big keyword here is that critical 1, because it nearly always just gives you a whole extra hit, because you're so likely to generate a surge off 7 dice. So yeah, really like those bottom 2 options for upgrading your rebel troopers. What I'm going to do now is I'm quickly just going to blast through sort of 3 versions of rebel troopers that I've kind of running or come into run against recently, and just talk about how each of them can be used and sort of why you would take each one when you were building an army. So as you probably sort of picked up from the previous sort of bit section I was talking about, with these two heavy weapons, if you just want to run a vanilla squad for a bit with a bit of extra firepower, they'll probably, I think they come in sort of 66, 67 points. It can be really nice, and you're throwing 6 black and a white with generally converting surges, which is about 4-ish hits, 4 or 5 hit, just over 4 hits, which is pretty good. And on average, you're probably getting a couple of crits in there, which means they're only running cover against 1 or 2, which means again those hits probably aren't coming off. So it can be really nice. And again, with that ion gun, I think it's just got so much value at that range 3 for just robbing any droids that you can of any actions, which is now so valuable in the game. The other version you can run is the sort of assault squad rebel troopers, which I think is a really interesting take on rebel troopers. This basically relies on your sort of early blitz coming in. This used to be a lot better when recon intel was cheaper as well, because you could get 3 moves turn 1 basically, with off the scout, and then the 2 moves, which would give you 3 dodges. You can also take prepared supplies for that 4th dodge if you want it. And then you've got Rebel Trooper Captain, which has 2 functions. It means you can't be suppressed, which is really nice because Rebel Troopers are going to be suppressed quite a lot. And it gives you that training slot to take situational awareness, which again lets you dodge crits. So on that turn 1, if you are prepared to put recon on them now, which I have not put on them, you can have this squad which can sort of charge up much more aggressively than it would be able to otherwise, because it has all those dodges on it and it is dodging crits. Should be noted, I don't think this is that good, and I think there are other units, Sleeper Cell, that do sort of what this squad is trying to do a bit better. But I think this is an interesting take, and if you do want your Rebel Troopers to be a bit more aggressive, I think this is a really interesting idea. The final version, version 3, is one where you just take them vanilla. And I think this is possibly the way that Rebel Troopers will end up being run, purely for the fact that currently what is making Rebels sort of competitive in a sense is that they have access to some very good special forces. So essentially what you do is you make a sacrifice in terms of what you're bringing with core to take, double sleeper cell and pathfinders, which I think is probably the most reliable way of taking rebel special forces now. It also might give you extra points, to take like an AA5 speeder truck or whatever. Like, just have those extra things, because those extra heavy weapons do really add up, and it's more than half the cost of an entire squad to put that heavy weapon on them. So perhaps not always worth it. But yeah, nothing wrong with the vanilla squad of rebel troopers if you just want something to fill up your core requirement and fill in some activations here or there. In terms of what you should do when list building with them, over here on the right is a list I took to a sort of casual tournament I played in recently. I took 5 rebel troopers with the ion gun, which was interesting. It was really bad, and I misplayed it as well, but it was really bad because you just basically, what I said earlier about not getting the dodges on the units that haven't acted yet happened en masse. And loads of my units just got blown away before they got a chance to do anything. So maximizing rebel troopers is probably not the way to go if you're looking for a really competitive list. But they can be overwhelming in large numbers, especially in those early turns when you can sort of be moving up with those dodges in advance. But you cannot rely on them to still be sticking around into the late game unless you play them very passively. Like, it doesn't really matter how carefully you play them in terms of hiding them in cover and stuff like that. With the white saves and with sort of, especially the low courage and stuff like that, they are just going to become sort of very neutered into sort of the mid game and the late game. So even if they don't die, they will probably be suppressed and then they'll just become kind of useless. If you can fit in vigilance, I was about to say it's worth it. It's an interesting one. 12 points, and generally you're probably going to get 4 or 5 dodges, maybe more if you're keeping them on core units from vigilance. So maybe it's worth it but I think unfortunately now, if you are running layer or hand, the priority is either improv or underworld connections for your sort of double operative mercenary stuff. So yeah, it's just very tricky to fit in, and it still is a little bit expensive. I think if they knocked it down to like 8 maybe, it would be more interesting, and obviously if more rebels got access to 2 command slots, it would be more interesting as well. If you want them to stay alive and you want them to be useful, they need someone to keep the enemy forces away from them a bit. they can sort of handle themselves a bit in the early game, as I've sort of hinted at, but like essentially if a big hero comes for them, they kill them. The flip side to that is if a hero is spending their whole action to kill a rebel trooper unit, that's maybe okay. Like it's maybe not an awful trade. So it just depends if you want to stay alive or not, or if you're happy using them as bait, essentially, I guess. But you know, if you've got Luke or Boba or Din or whoever, just to give you a bit of space, that could be really nice to sort of push them back a bit. Even Wicket can be interesting for just holding enemy force users off a bit. Yeah, they're perfectly good if you take no kit on them as activation fillers, objective grabbers. Like you're not sad about leaving 40 points at the back of the board or sending them off to grab something on shifting priorities or whatever. Like that's fine. And with those two dodges as well, they become actually, if they are a long way away and just being plinked off or whatever, those dodges can come in really useful. Yeah, I've already talked about the agile dodges in the early game, so I don't think there's any point going over those again. I'll go quickly through, a couple of deployments and just talk about how they can be used on these deployments. I think it's probably fairly clear from what I've said so far about, how to best squeeze some value out of these units. But essentially, we'll start with Breakthrough. Breakthrough is quite an interesting one because there is the potential, because of how far up both of the deployment areas push, for some early game aggression from both sides. And this is actually probably a scenario that Rebel Troopers are fairly, well, stronger in than they would be otherwise, purely because they get those dodges in the early game, which means that you're not quite as afraid of the early game aggression with Rebel Troopers as you would be for like fleets or veterans have low profile, but with fleets especially, because it actually, if they're spending time trying to shoot through your dodges early game, it feels okay. Like you're probably going to lose quite a lot of a unit because the dodges won't go far enough and your saves won't make up for it. But yeah, Rebel Troopers are okay on Breakthrough. Generally, I would sort of drop not up too aggressively, like stay maybe bunched up in the corner, hopefully near your commander or whoever, to hopefully drop them some dodges or something. But yeah, kind of back a little bit further, sitting at that nice range 3, and basically your priority with any deployment with Rebel Troopers is to think about what is going to happen the turn after. Because on turn 1, with those dodges, you're not a very sort of attractive target to any of your enemy's units. The following turn, when you have no dodges, is when it starts to become a lot easier, even if you're in heavy cover, to absolutely shred a unit in one shot, especially if they have any sharpshooter. So don't so much focus on trying to get value on that turn 1, focus on positioning them for turn 2 in such a way that they're not immediately just going to get blown off the board. And also in such a way that maybe after a move and a shoot, you can be near sort of pushing onto an objective with that dodge set up, which just gives you a little bit of a deterrent against any sort of shooting attacks. Close the Pocket is a similar story, but you almost want to be even more passive. Again, in such a way, because these deployment zones are actually fairly close. I think they're only range 3 apart on the long edge. It does mean that you want to be just a little bit careful about how far your opponent can move on, because with a scout move and a move afterwards, I'm thinking about arcs here, for instance, they're effectively able to sort of shoot up to range 4 and actually just a bit past range 4. So one thing that can be sort of fairly effective is maybe just to actually bunch up towards the center rather than trying to compete with the big hitting units that will normally come out on the flanks. So if you can get them sort of close and get, a reasonable sort of density of Rebel Troopers in the center, en masse, they can actually be a little bit scary. Like they're not going to be something that your opponent's like running afraid of, but with, a couple of heavy weapons maybe, and maybe backed up by a hero, they can be quite nice for hopefully just a bit of a deterrent on maybe that central objective. So not trying to use the Rebel Troopers to compete on the flanks, but moving them into the center to try and bunch up together. And again, if you're running like Leia or a Rebel Officer or something in range of that Exemplar to get that extra dodge, which can sometimes be the difference between a unit being blown up in one turn and a unit surviving. So yeah, that's Rebel Troopers. In terms of a tier list position, it's a little bit tricky to sort of think about how to rank them here because you have to take core. And as a result, while I don't think that Rebel Troopers are a B tier unit, I think they're a bit worse than a B tier unit. I think they're actually near a C. Because you are required to take either fleets, vets, or Rebel Troopers, I think currently Rebel Troopers are the best bet. So you could actually make an argument if you really wanted to that they are S tier. I don't think that's the case because I think fleets also serve a purpose and aren't better or worse necessarily than Rebel Troopers, but can provide a sort of scary deterrent at that range too. So I'm gonna put them at the top of B tier for now, but I can definitely see the argument because you have to take core for sort of bumping them up a little bit more. But this isn't saying, for instance, here that Rebel Troopers are more powerful than Boba because I don't think they are. I'm just saying that because you have to take that core contingent, they are in this case probably the best of a bad bunch. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. I did put a little poll out, which came back with 100% of people voting for Rebel Troopers as the unit they take. I'm sure some people like, there's that 20 something activation Rebel Trooper, sorry, the Rebel Veteran Mark II blaster um, that ran around for a while that basically just had too many units to kill. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. I've actually really enjoyed Rebel Troopers with that agile buff. Like, it makes them feel a bit less useless than they were before. I still don't think they're a build around, as I've said, but they're definitely not as much of a hindrance as they used to be. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below, and we'll see you for the next one.